Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I am Victoria Newland. I am the CEO of the Center for a New American Security. We are delighted to welcome you to this event this afternoon on U.S. geopolitical challenges and opportunities in the era of lower oil prices, which is timed to coincide with our report on these issues that many of our panelists were involved with. As you all know, the era of energy abundance for the United States is upon us. This is a historic change for us, and it offers a whole range of new policy opportunities and potentially policy tools in the strategic environment. So I am confident that you will have a very rich discussion on these subjects this afternoon. I want to welcome all of our panelists and friends and adjuncts of the center who are here with us today, and turn it over to our senior fellow and program director for energy, economics, and security here at CNAS to lead the conversation, Liz Rosenberg. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Toria. Actually, I'm going to put this up here for now. Yeah, thank you. So thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to pull this forward so I can see you all a little bit better. For this discussion on energy geopolitics. As you can tell, we originally conceived of this project and the report we're releasing in an era following the price collapse in 2014 when prices were distinctively lower than they were prior to that price fall. Now they're more robust. They've climbed significantly since then, but it underscores, sorry, one second. The need, nevertheless, to talk about why that's the case and what the producer and consumer dynamics are that underscore this change. So as we talked about initially, we are in this era of energy abundance, and the principles of scarcity that animated policy and drove trading patterns and foreign investment patterns for consumers have changed and fallen away. And there's a lot more to discuss for what this means for the United States in particular as one of a number of significant producers in this environment. I'm not going to spend too much time setting the stage more with these new producer-consumer dynamics. I'm going to turn to our panel to discuss that more fully. We have a wonderful panel today. Let me introduce them. Starting right here next to me, Ed Chow, Senior Fellow at CSIS. Megan O'Sullivan in the red, professor at Harvard's Kennedy School. We have David Gordon on the end, adjunct senior fellow at CNAS, and with a number of other affiliations as well. And Divya Reddy, practice head for energy and natural resources at the Eurasia Group. So I'll ask a couple of questions and we'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes together on the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from all of you. And we'll end on time. It's the end of the day, so at 4 p.m. So Megan, let me turn to you first. Can you give us some overview comments about what has changed in the energy market since 2014, why these prices collapsed as they did, and what this then means for the major producers and consumers in the market, the power relations between these two constituencies?
Right, so you're asking me to summarize everything in 2 to 3 minutes, but let me just say a couple of words. First, I'd just like to thank Toria and like to thank Liz for having me and my fellow panelists here to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting things happening in global affairs today, and that's the big changes in the energy environment and how they're reshaping global politics. So if we start in 2014, as Liz suggested, you're all familiar with the price collapse that happened at the end of that year, and that really had to do with two things, which was the oversupply that came about as a result of a number of things, but maybe most importantly, American shale production started to really increase global supply. And alongside other producers, we were falling into a market where supply exceeded demand somewhat significantly, and OPEC, instead of taking its traditional role of cutting production in that kind of environment, it decided not to do anything, and actually individual producers increased production. And this led to what eventually was a precipitous drop in the price. You'll remember at the beginning of 2016, we were looking at oil prices under $30 And that was very, very significant. So we all tend to look at prices, but I think what's even more interesting is what this has meant for energy markets, both oil and natural gas. And when we talk about geopolitics, we can't forget that natural gas is in some ways even more interesting when we think about geopolitics, because there has been these very strong traditional relationships between consumers and producers. So just on the oil market side, I would say very briefly, the big change was that we went from an oil market where OPEC and big producers played a very significant role. They didn't set the price of oil, but they calibrated production in a way that they really had a lot of influence over where that oil price came in. And when you had these American shale producers producing a lot more energy and OPEC kind of receding from that role, you suddenly, for the first time really in decades, you had the market playing the main role in reconciling supply and demand. So if you're an economist or you've studied economics, you would say, what's the big deal about price being determined by supply and demand? That's true in so many things, but it really hasn't historically been true in the oil market. There's always been an intermediary, whether it's Standard Oil or the East Texas Railway Commission or OPEC. And so we saw OPEC recede. It's kind of come back in a way that we can talk about. And that has had big geopolitical ramifications, obviously. On the natural gas side, we've seen this big increase in natural gas in the United States in particular, but in other countries as well, in Australia in particular. But we see other producers bringing more natural gas online. And this has coincided with advances in technology in liquefied natural gas. So suddenly, we're seeing a big increase in the amount of natural gas consumed globally that isn't piped from one destination to another, but is actually liquefied and passed by ship. And that matters because it changes some of the dynamics of the market. It means that geography is no longer such a constraint on where you buy your natural gas or where that natural gas that you produce is consumed. So that traditional relationship between the producer and the consumer is a lot less political, and natural gas, I like to say, becomes a lot more like oil. And so we've seen natural gas markets. There used to be multiple natural gas markets, and there still are, but they're converging a little bit. We're seeing the emergence of something that looks a little bit more like a global natural gas market, in the sense that what happens in one area affects the price of gas in other markets. So what this has meant for geopolitics, I'm just going to say, I'll just say a couple words about the U.S. and I'll leave the other parts of the world for you to touch on with the other panelists. For the United States, this is actually, as Liz said, a huge sea change for us. Obviously, in the sense of being, now the United States, when you look at oil and gas combined, the U.S. is the largest producer in the world. It is now producing more oil almost than it's ever produced in its history. And this is coming back from a situation where American oil production was on decline. We're now virtually self-sufficient in natural gas, and in the last couple of years, we've become an exporter of both natural gas and crude oil in pretty significant quantities. So this is good. I like to say this is good for both American hard and soft power, that has kind of reinforced the foundations of American power, both in terms of economics, in terms of our ability to influence markets. But it's also reshaped the global environment in a way that I would say is, on the whole, conducive to American interests. And I think that's a lot of what we'll talk about here today. It's also underpinned the Trump administration's energy dominance policy, which I'm still not 100% clear on what it is, but it's really very much focused on this burgeoning oil and gas production. That the Trump administration is the first administration in a very long time to come in and recognize that energy is an asset, not a vulnerability for the United States. And I think there's a lot of work to be done or thinking to be done about how that actually influences our foreign policy. I know when I go around the world, I'm increasingly hearing from people that they're worried the U.S. is going to use its energy largesse as a political weapon. People are asking me, is the U.S. going to be a reliable supplier? Which is a question that kind of takes me aback. But then when I think about it, it's actually an appropriate question. We've used energy for geopolitical reasons before. You think about the use of sanctions, that's the use of energy as a geopolitical tool. And certainly some of the signs we get from the administration is that they are leaning on some of our allies and other potential partners to buy more American natural gas, buy American oil. And there's no quid pro quo necessarily, but some people think that it might be implicit. So I think there's still a lot to be determined about how this energy abundance translates into American foreign policy. My personal view in one sentence is we should be pretty happy and satisfied with the positive changes it's made in markets, and we don't necessarily have to use energy as a bludgeon, as a foreign policy tool, that we can continue with a policy that really underpins the smooth functioning of energy markets, and that will have the virtue of working in favor of American interests in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Megan. And that was actually an excellent brief summary here's a shout out to the book that she just published. So for more information and a broader explanation, that's a good resource.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you also introduced in the end of your remarks the concept of using energy as a foreign policy instrument, which given that we do a lot of work here at foreign policy and national security, a great interest of mine that I want to pick up on in the next question to you, Ed. So another active proponent of the employment of energy in the exercise of foreign policy has been Russia. Though much has been written about this, which may overcredit their employ of energy in the exercise of this foreign policy. But talking about Russia more generally, can you talk a little bit about how Russia is now doing in this energy environment as a massive producer, an important supplier of natural gas, you mentioned, of course, to Europe, and now to others, of course, in a growing natural gas LNG expansion and crude oil, and how you perceive Russia's conception of using energy as a foreign policy tool is, how is that changing now?
Thank you very much, Liz, for inviting me on this panel and for the question. This is a question I've been thinking and struggling with quite a bit recently. I think what happened, a couple of things. One, on the question of price, people often forget that this is a cyclical industry.
Yeah.
And I've been observing this industry inside and outside for 40 years. And even people in the industry sometimes forget it is a cyclical industry. And when the price collapsed in 2014 and followed quickly simultaneously with Western economic sanctions against Russia because of the annexation of Crimea first and then the Russian aggression in Donbass. And then when prices went below $30 in January of 2016, I think that really concentrated Russian policymakers' minds on what to do. And this is something that I've been thinking about a bit, and I wrote a little bit about it last year in a piece that CSI has put out in November on the bromance between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And what it struck me at the time is maybe some of our pre-existing assumptions about Russia and its relationship with OPEC is changing. Mm-hmm. That whereas previously we always assumed that Russia was going to be a price taker mm-hmm. in a market that is controlled by anybody, is controlled by OPEC, that maybe Russia has become a petrostate in a way that the Soviet Union wasn't before. And a petrostate would have a different view on price setting than before. Just a couple of figures. At the peak of prices in 2014, oil and gas represented 50% of Russian central government revenue. It represented 70% of export earnings. So by any definition of a petrostate, Russia seemed to look like one. So then we were caught somewhat by surprise, not only by the Saudi Russian-led OPEC, non-OPEC agreement, but the discipline that they kept, the countries who had traditionally not been very good at this, kept, mainly with Saudi Arabia overperforming on production cuts and Russia promising not to grow its production as it had done previously. The other observation I would make is that people and sometimes companies and countries tend to do what they know how to do rather than what needs to be done. So if you look at the Russian economy objectively, you would say, well, maybe you're over-dependent on oil and gas and you need to modernize and diversify your economy. But what does one need to do to diversify your economy? I mean, you have to reform, which is really hard. If it weren't hard, you would have already done it. And it requires decentralization of power, probably. It requires removing corruption from the system, protecting property rights, implementing rule of law, all things that fundamentally question the foundation of the Putin regime, it seems to me. So if you can't do that, what do? You do what you do best. And what does Russia do best? Well, one area is active measures, which David can tell you about, what that means. And we've seen all kinds of forms of that recently. The other is oil and gas. So from my point of view, Russia has doubled down on oil and gas rather than diversifying its economy, modernizing its economy. I wrote another piece in February about Rosneft as the new international major. And which is, I think, an example of rather than diversifying, doubling down. Not only in oil and gas domestically, but also in investing overseas. And some of the choices are quite remarkable. You know, let's invest more equities into Venezuela, just as the Venezuelan economy and politics seem to be collapsing. In contrast, the Chinese are withdrawing from Venezuela. The Russians are moving in full speed ahead, seeing the opportunity of low prices as presenting the area that they can move into in America's backyard, in a sense. And being able to play all sides of any conflict. Investing and doing business with Baghdad, at the same time you're doing business with the Kurdish regional government. Working in not only with Saudi Arabia, but within a month after the king visited Moscow, Vladimir Putin went to Tehran. So working both sides of the Persian Gulf, for sure. Involvement in Qatar, involvement in Egypt, involvement with both opposing sides in the Libyan conflict. It's really quite remarkable. Doing business with China on energy, but also exploring offshore Vietnam at the same time. Selling arms, by the way, to both countries that have this dispute over the South China Sea. Buying a major refining company in India. So they really are playing all sides and seeing, I think, oil and gas not only from the economic standpoint, but also as a geopolitical tool. That's the sense that I'm getting from the recent developments.
I want to ask you a follow-up question on this. So you just mentioned an array of different foreign investment and engagements that Russian energy companies are involved in. Nevertheless, some of the 2014 sanctions restrictions, for example, made it more difficult for Russia to engage in certain what we might call frontier energy technologies. And some people are thinking ahead to the medium and long-term capacity for Russian production. Will these investments and arrangements that it's making now be able to indeed replace those reserves and keep this production outlook very strong? So I want to hear your comments on that. What about restrictions and investment now? Will it allow Russia to continue this outward-looking, robust campaign? And then what you think that means about the conduct it's engaging in today?
Well, I think sanctions, you would agree, is a whole different discussion altogether. The
Leave that aside. Just the
efficacy
technology restrictions about that.
of sanctions and what the objective is and
Yeah.
whether it's an effective tool or not. I think in terms of the domestic oil and gas industry in Russia, the key is they are a low-cost producer. And so, they will be able to produce at the current rate for a very, very long time, given that they are a low-cost producer. The revenue gain may be different. And the impact on the central government budget and on Russian oil companies may be different, given the nature of the Russian taxation system on oil and gas. But I think the sanctions, first of all, the sanctions after 2014 were never designed to restrict Russian production in the short to medium term. They were designed to reduce the prospects in the medium to longer term in order to achieve political objectives, perhaps. So to the extent that political objectives have not yet been achieved, there is, as you know, much talk about whether the sanctions themselves need to change or to be tightened or not. That's one issue. I think you have to separate the domestic investments, given the nature of Russian oil and gas provinces geologically and the fact that they have low access to low costs and large resources, from what they're doing overseas. The efficacy of the overseas investment is yet to be proven. Just because they're doing it doesn't mean that they do it well or succeed. I would say the same thing about China's Belt and Road policy, by the way. Just because they're spending a lot of money doesn't mean that they're going to win. They may fail miserably at the same time. And a lot of these are high risk. So you ask yourself, why would an oil and gas country double down on investments overseas when they have domestic opportunities?
What's the answer, Ed?
Well, I think geopolitics has to be part of the answer. That their metric for success is different than ours. We tend to think of profitability, and maybe they have other measures to judge success by than we do.
Okay. Well, you've teed up the world's most important growing consumers and mentioning China. So, David, I want to talk to you, call on you next to talk a little bit about China in particular, but also India as very significant growing global consumers of energy itself, hydrocarbons, but also the technology and a growing involvement in the sphere in an array of ways. So talk a little bit about how China and India are approaching this new set of dynamics from a policy perspective and their energy trading patterns.
Yeah. So China and India were both enormous beneficiaries of this, and it's hard to overstate that. If you look at the impact on the trade balance, on the balance of payments, that at a time when the global economy was really pretty weak still, 2013, 2014, to have this enormous collapse in prices was just an incredible boost economically. But I think it also had broader strategic implications for both, and particularly for China. I think that if you look at China's approach to the external world prior to the price collapse, it was overwhelmingly driven by a defensive thrust in terms of protecting and ensuring an adequate supply of natural resources and especially of energy resources. That was the main thing that China was doing in the rest of the world. And I think after 2014, the Chinese view on this shifted very, very dramatically, as did perceptions about the market more generally, the things that Megan was talking about, that in the period running up to 2014, everybody was talking about peak oil, and for big consumer countries, particularly for China and India, they were looking at the other as a potential problem in their achieving their own energy security. All right, so I think that both China and India not only had this direct, incredible trade and balance of payments and fiscal benefit from this, but they also became a lot less worried about energy security and a lot less worried about the other as a source of potential conflict and competition for very scarce energy resources. If you go back 4 or 5 years ago, everybody was talking about the imminence of peak oil, the likelihood of supply going down, and that was something that was very, very risky. I would go so far to say that I think that these changes were a major driver behind President Xi Jinping's decision to basically let go of Deng Xiaoping's recommendation that China needs for a very long time to hide and buy, to be a lot more cautious, to be basically defensive, that China became a lot more opportunistic, and I think it is marked, that's the transition point between China playing defense externally, both ensuring its supply, but being very worried about the ability of the United States to potentially threaten that supply, and China heading off a lot more actively and independently on its own, with BRI, with a much more overt and extensive relationship with Russia on energy and other issues. So I think that the geopolitical impact was huge. There's a paradox here, I think, in terms of China-U.S. relations. And I think it is that, on the one hand, this shift in energy creates an enormous opportunity in energy markets, creates an enormous opportunity for China-U.S. market interaction, particularly around natural gas. Right? If China wants to really shift the trade balance, buy a lot more U.S. natural gas, and that's not a crazy idea. So I think that on the one hand you have a lot of possibilities here, but at the same time, I think China became more confident about its ability to go off essentially independent of the United States and in potential conflict with the United States in a way that it was just unwilling to in the time period leading up to that. So I think there's a real paradox here. Very quickly on India, I think that India, again, huge beneficiary. I think India's responded to this in market terms by also going out on its own buying spree in recent years. Geopolitically, however, I think the Indians have deepened their relationships with the Gulf states, partially because they just have an enormous number of their citizens resident in the Gulf. But I think they also are trying to balance what has for a long time been their predominant relationship with Iran. And I think generally, if you look at the energy politics element of India's behavior, it's doing a lot more with the U.S. and U.S. allies. Now, that could very well be tested if, as expected, the administration exits the JCPOA, and then we will see what will the Indians do at that point in terms of continuing to purchase oil from Iran. During the time of the Iranian oil embargo, when we were putting a lot of pressure on our friends, the Indians were a big problem in terms of U.S. diplomacy. We'll see how much we may very well see in the next months, if that's changed or not.
In the next weeks, maybe. I want to ask a follow-up question to you, David, and Megan. I'm going to ask you to answer the same question, and then we're coming to Divya. But following up on the bilateral relationship issues, the United States and China, and the United States and India, and taking it back to the perspective from Washington and in the United States, the community of energy analysts are carefully studying and fairly well aware of some of these dynamics that you laid out, some of the new approach to energy investment and trade from China and looking forward, and India and looking forward. But when it comes to the foreign policy community, the national security community in Washington, what's the thinking like about appreciating how dynamic, how really rapidly this transformation has occurred in China and in India, and what that means? And I can ask you both because you both sit between two constituencies of energy and foreign policy thinkers. So over to you.
Please. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
You're so gracious. Thank you, folks.
So, I mean, the administration has articulated its energy dominance theme here. I would have called this energy liberation. I think energy liberation would have had a lot more appeal beyond our borders, and that's what it really is. It's for consumer countries. It's liberating the markets from this control by a cartel that had artificially propped prices up, and I think the actions are consistent to that, but nobody wants to be dominated in the energy sphere, and so I think the language here is a little self-defeating in my view, but I think that part of the challenge here is that we just had so little going on during the unfortunate period of Secretary Tillerson's time at the State Department that we had begun actually in the Obama administration to do a lot more on energy diplomacy. And we had some very good people working on it. Some of those people are still there, but I don't think there's been as active an approach yet. So my view, and I have a bias here, but I think that Secretary Pompeo will be very active here, and I think he has a pretty good set of tools to play with. So I suspect we'll see more activity here, but I don't think thus far. It's like a lot of issues since the Trump administration came in that there hasn't been the full mobilization of domestic resources. I think it's been very hard to do things across agencies, and this would inherently have to be across agencies. But I'm pretty optimistic that that's going to change with Secretary Pompeo.
Mm-hmm. So let me just make two comments. One on what I think kind of the root of the problem is, and then two, on this energy independence, which I think is, a theme that we hear from politicians and not just this administration. I think there has been considerable progress in Washington for policymakers who appreciate that energy and energy markets do have bearing on foreign policy. So I think there's a growing appreciation of that. Yes. The State Department now has a bureau which was sort of slated to close, but now hopefully will stay open. So I don't want to say that this problem hasn't gotten better over time, but I think there's something kind of fundamental at the root of the problem, which is a human nature issue, which is that people, when they look at an issue, there's someone named Bob Jervis, who many of you may know. He does a lot of work on political issues and psychology and human nature. And as humans, we look at problems and we can only attribute so many causalities to the problem. So we might think there's 3 reasons why there's this problem. There may be 300, but our brains can't absorb the 300 issues. So we focus on the 3. And we tend to focus on issues that we understand. And I would say that policymakers in the foreign policy world haven't necessarily been very well versed on the intricacies of energy markets that can be quite technical. Ask your average foreign policy person if they know what contango means or backwardation, and my guess is you will have
Contango's a dance, right?
Right, that's probably the good response you'll get. So I think policymakers, because there's a technical element of energy markets that is not necessarily accessible to everyone, they tend to ignore the role that markets have on foreign policy. I think, again, it's getting better, but I think that's a little bit of a human nature problem. Secondly, on energy independence, we still hear from this administration, we've heard from, every administration about the desire for energy independence. My view is that's misplaced, that, if people think about energy independence in the sense of we want to be an energy island in some way, that might be the most extreme way of thinking about it. And really, these trends that we've all been discussing open the possibility that that could be true for the first time in a long time. Like now it's not just a pipe dream. In my book I call it America's unrequited love, energy independence. But I still think it's the wrong thing to focus on, even if maybe it would be conceivable under a certain set of circumstances. When we talk about energy independence or energy liberation, we should just be thinking about an energy situation that means we no longer have to contort our foreign policy in a way that we wouldn't otherwise if we weren't trying to meet energy objectives. So if you think about, the desire for oil and gas and other sources of energy, but particularly oil and gas at a reasonable price, has corrupted our foreign policy in certain ways, meaning that it has required us to do certain things, build certain relationships, tolerate certain violations of this and that if we can be energy liberated, it just means that we can remove those elements of our foreign policy because we won't be tied to the need to put energy so high on our agenda. And I think that's already within reach. And so we shouldn't look at energy independence as just being a number on a balance sheet, but actually just think about it as an attitude in our forein policy. So,
Liz, if I can just build on a couple of things I heard from both David and Megan and translate it into practical industry terms. It's not whether China is going to buy U.S. LNG or not. That's not the issue. China can buy as much spot U.S. LNG as they want. Doesn't help build the U.S. LNG export industry. The question from an industry practical point of view is, would a Chinese company commit to a long-term financial guarantee to buy LNG from this project at a certain volume for 15, 20 years in order for that project to become financeable? And that would help build the US LNG export industry. And that's where energy dominance run against the grain of what you're trying to do. Is would Sinopec, which said when Trump was in Beijing in November last year, they're going to invest more than $50 billion in Alaskan LNG in a country that wants to dominate you on energy. Does that really work? And I think it really, that's the level of sophistication on American foreign policy making or policy making in general that I don't see, even as it is paying more attention and it is much more aware of energy than before.
So I love this setup, actually, because now I want to turn our conversation to thinking about climate change policy and renewables. And if we're talking about the evolution of the way we think about energy and the way it may be assimilated or not into foreign policy thinking, this is a great time to focus on the fact that there is a growing mainstream appreciation for the role of climate change policy within a mainstream understanding of energy markets, energy policy, and the significance of energy and climate policy to foreign policy. But it's much more nascent. And so these challenges that you're pointing out are magnified when it comes to having a broader understanding of what the energy picture should look like from the commercial perspective, the foreign policy implications, natural resources stewardship, a decarbonizing economy. So Divya, will you lead us into thinking a little bit more about how this new hydrocarbon price environment is bearing on thinking about climate change efforts, policy, and renewable energy economics broadly? You can give us a brief overview and then drill down on that.
Okay, yeah. So basically, traditionally you've had an environment where high oil prices serve as somewhat of a motivator to pursue kind of off fossil fuel agendas. So on the flip side, if you have a low price environment, you would expect that the kind of effort to move away from fossil fuels starts to thin a little bit. But what we're seeing now is that I don't think you're really seeing that much of that trend taking hold. And there are a few reasons for that. And one is, to your point, Liz, that the kind of imperative around climate change policy has grown stronger globally. And I think that trend is probably sustainable. So even though you have the U.S., from a federal perspective, backtracking on its climate change commitments, I think from a global perspective, there is a stronger momentum and imperative. So the U.S. is a little bit more of an anomaly than a trend in this sense, and that trend will probably continue to hold and guide kind of energy policy making. The other issue is also that beyond just climate change per se, that you have a lot of focus, especially in emerging markets, on environmental policy, environmental issues more broadly, especially air pollution issues, and that serves as a stronger imperative for governments to tackle environmental issues. And that has spillover implications, obviously, because the policies on environmental and air pollution have benefits on climate change too. So that's another driver. And then the third one is that the technology for clean energy, so renewables, electric vehicles, all that is coming down quite precipitously. And so where traditionally there's been a sort of framework of trade-off considered between tackling climate change and the economic costs associated with that, that's sort of less of an impediment now than it was previously, and as the technology continues to improve, probably will become less and less of an impediment going forward. And I think that has a few interesting implications for the purposes of our discussion here. One is that if you assume there's a certain stickiness around climate change policy because of those reasons, that over time, it's sort of a fair assumption that this concept of oil scarcity becomes less of a linchpin or overarching driver for energy policy, but especially for national security decision making. The other sort of less constructive implication, I think, is that because of all the momentum going into clean energy, there is a lot of investment, and the sort of same kind of mercantilist approach that we saw in oil previously is starting to come up in clean energy, where there's a race to sort of dominate in terms of clean energy technologies. And so that has some implications, I think, where the U.S. and U.S. companies might face a disadvantage given the policy environment here. But it also sets up for a situation where countries it sets up for more conflict, essentially, between what otherwise would be a constructive relationship between the U.S. And China in a low-price environment, potentially creates more of a competitive environment. And China in particular is pursuing policies that very directly prop up these industries, and they see them as the industries of the future. So it's very much sort of embodied in the Made in China 2025 strategy. And India and others are also pursuing these types of investments for the same reasons. And so, you could see a situation where there's a lot of protectionism coming up in these types of industries, and that poses risks of trade actions, trade tensions, and we're already seeing signs of that as we saw tariffs. The U.S. imposed tariffs on solar panel imports, largely directed at China. And then we're also, it's sort of part of the 301 tariffs that are coming, where clean energy will be probably one plank of a broader protectionism around technology.
Thank you. So people here, there's a bunch of people here who've been used to thinking about energy geopolitics with some of its leading constituents. And in this sort of power struggle, we have the producers and the consumers. So as for good reasons you've mentioned, the geopolitics of renewable energy are decoupling from hydrocarbon energy price signals, and they're here to stay. But help us think about who the main actors are in this new geopolitics of renewable energy.
Yeah.
And one thing I might take from what you said is, well, it's the renewable and energy technology producers and the renewable energy technology consumers, which leads us to maybe superimpose the U.S. versus China struggle. But is that right? Is that how we should be thinking about this? Who are the key constituents?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, the technology developers are usually the technology consumers as well. So it's the markets that see a need for additional amount of renewables into their fuel mix, have policies that support that, and in some cases where the government actually supports the development of those industries, so actually subsidizes them in a big way. So in that sense, it is similar. The sort of similar players come up where I think it'd be the big players on the renewable side will be China, will be Europe, and will be the U.S. Potentially some smaller players like India becoming bigger, but those probably are the three. But I think the other sort of side of this coin is that there's the geopolitics of oil stems from the sort of geographic dispersion of oil assets and the overdependence on certain regions. And for wind and solar, wind and solar are obviously free for countries that are producing them. But I think you have to go further back in the supply chain where that competition might come up, where there are a lot of specialty minerals that are very much cornerstones of renewable energy and even electric vehicle development that are even more geographically concentrated compared to oil. So, for example, lithium is heavily concentrated in 3 Latin American countries. Cobalt is heavily concentrated in the African copper belt, so in the DRC specifically. And rare earths is sort of less scarce in terms of where the reserves are, but the production is almost entirely in China. So, those kinds of resources become more of a source of geopolitical tensions potentially, compared to a sort of different dynamic in oil.
So, in the next 20 years, are we looking at OPEC for lithium and cobalt?
Possibly. And you're starting to see companies trying to lock in resources in some of these countries
Right.
and make deals early on. But the geographic concentration is quite heavy. And so there will be leverage that these countries have if they're a dominant supplier of that mineral.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm now going to open to your questions. If you have one, you can raise your hand. I think the mic is actually over here. Can we ask for help? Eileen's got help with the mic. You're going to use that one? Great, thank you. Okay, so let's start with a question here and then come to the front.
Thank you. Alexa.
Sorry, and may I just, you might have been doing this. Let us know who you are and your
Sure.
affiliation.
Thanks. Alexa Van Ann at Pittsburgh Partners in New York. Okay, I have 2 questions, if that's okay. The first one is for Dr. O'Sullivan. I wanted to ask you about some of the technology that you very briefly touched on. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on the Yamal site in Russia, where they're trying to develop technology to basically make it a viable LNG site. And then for Mr. Cho, can you talk a little bit about Russia's difficulty in developing software to support its oil and gas industry with sanctions that ban Western software for them?
And I may thank you for your question. I'm just going to pile on and ask about pile on to the last one by broadening it to get at Russian indigenous service more broadly for the energy sector. So not merely software, but also drilling technologies. So whoever wants, you start with Yamal. Yeah,
I'll start, but I actually think probably that Ed
to Ed
would be a really good person to talk about Yamal. So just very briefly, in terms of my sense, Yamal is actually operating. So it's one of these Arctic LNGs that has come online and is actually bringing Russia much more squarely into the LNG space. And that in itself will be a new development. And my understanding is that a lot of these sanctions are on technologies that could make this challenging in other Arctic locations. So that there's potentially, as was spoken about before, it's potentially a question about future capabilities and future investments. But, Ed is really the expert on that. So
just on Yamal, I think you're probably referring to the second stage of the Yamal LNG, which is a project that's being talked about. And interestingly, there's been talk about Saudi Arabia investing in the second stage of Yamal. On your other question, again, you may have to use second best technology, but it doesn't stop you from producing large basins with good production nature. So I don't think that that's a problem for the Russian industry. Yes, maybe it's not as cost effective as if you've used the best technology. A lot of the Western services companies have joint ventures in Russia. Again, the sanctions were not designed to affect current production. The sanctions were designed to affect Arctic drilling, offshore, and shale oil specifically. Those were the things that were targeted. And those were always going to be 5-10 years away anyway. So if you look, it depends on the time frame you're looking at. If you're looking at the next 2-3 years or within the next 5 years, I would say, I don't see sanctions unless we really tighten them to a point of applying secondary sanctions and then also applying to purchases of Russian oil and gas. The effect of the dollar is the exchange. You have to toughen the sanctions a lot to affect Russian production. Just while I've got the floor, Prime Minister Modi is meeting Xi Jinping tomorrow. I would suggest to you, if you're concerned about Iran sanctions, for example, in the longer run, that may be a more important meeting than the Merkel-Trump meeting also tomorrow. Modi was already scheduled to be in China in June for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization annual meeting. Why did he choose to make another trip to China? They have lots of issues to discuss, certainly. But if you think of those two countries as the incremental demand centers for global oil, and we may be the incremental supplier because of the nature of shale oil, they have a lot of business to discuss in this area, including, for example, the use of RMB to settle contracts, the new Shanghai crude futures market. Watch this space, I would say.
I know. I watched with interest the launch of the crude contract. So we had another question up here. We'll come to you. And then to you, sir.
Thank you. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. David, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked you probably 2.5 years ago. There have been changes since then. See, it's what's modified. There used to be a compact between the U.S. and the Arab oil
Right.
states. They provided us energy security. We provided them defense and political security. That's changed since then. Could you talk a little bit about what those changes are? Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's sort of muscularity, the relations with Iran, the GCC rift, things of that sort.
Yeah. So I think that Saudi Arabia and the rise of Prince Mohammed bin Salman really is the big important impact of everything that we've been talking about in that part of the world. That up until NBS's rise, the Saudis had actually done very little on diversification, and I think that the price collapse in 2014. Of course, they were the decision makers who did not want to follow the traditional OPEC path in the face of weakening demand to get to a supply management scheme. But I think they were totally surprised by the depth and the length of the contraction, and that was soon after followed by the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal. So these were two very big body blows for what had given the Saudis confidence in their position in the world, was that the U.S. had their back and that they were the key players in the Asian markets. And so I think the rise of NBS is a response to that. I think that what NBS is trying to do, frankly, is to basically use Saudi's continuing position in the oil markets in particular to start a transition in which Saudi Arabia would sort of replace Dubai as the regional financial center. So if you look at what the Saudis are saying openly, they're talking about transforming their sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, the PIF, into the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world over a several-year period. Now, the only way that they can do that is by selling not 5% of Aramco, but probably 20%, or maybe even a little more than that of Aramco. They're looking very carefully at institutions like Temasek, the Singaporean sovereign wealth fund, at China's CIC, in terms of models of using wealth as a means of enhancing national power and national security. So that's the vision here, but it is not going to be easy. So, I mean, NBS is doing all of the things that we Americans have been talking to Saudi Arabia about since 9/11. But, this is not a country that I think is conducive to rapid change. And certain things he can do. So he was able to do to really constrain the access of the far-flung elements of the royal family to the budget. That's a really important thing to do. I think the Saudis have done a very good job in taking the size of the budget down so that the sort of price that they need for a barrel of oil to balance the budget has dropped from close to 100 into the 70s. That's a very big deal. But some of the other stuff is just it is much harder to do. It has to do with institutional relationships. It has to do with, the lack of a work culture there. So I don't think that you can be optimistic about where all of this is going to go in a timing sense. But at the same time, I think the Saudis absolutely have been trying very hard to hedge in terms of their worries about the United States. So, Prince MBS was in the U.S. for 2 weeks. Obviously, the Saudis want a very close relationship with the U.S. They're willing to do a lot more than they've ever done, but they're at the same time working very hard to establish much closer ties with both Russia and China. That's less to do because they don't want to become more independent of the U.S. They still want, on the security side, to have that very close embrace. But they're very concerned about ensuring that both Russia and China don't lean as heavily towards the Iranian side of this Sunni Shia Saudi Iran confrontation that we've seen in the region. I don't give MBS nearly as high a grade in terms of regional politics. I think that the Lebanon thing really, I think, made the Saudis look stupid. The Saudis can't be happy that President Trump not only met with the Emir of Qatar a week and a half ago, but had nice things to say about him. And I think the Qataris look to me as if they're going to be able to withstand this. They're willing to pay the cost, and I think that the Saudis are not going to get their way. So he's still feeling himself out.
Thank you. Oh, is that okay?
That's fine.
I could talk about this all day, and particularly if we veer into Iran, but we'll take a few more questions. Yes, thank you. And then we'll go to the back of the room.
Okay, thank you. Marvin Ott, Johns Hopkins, and the Wilson Center. This is a little bit outside the arena, but it's in the green energy space. Decarbonization, climate engineering. What are the prospects that sort of pie in the sky technology will in fact become a really big deal and will start to change the whole energy landscape, technology landscape? That's the main question, and just almost a throwaway, but I wonder if the panel would be willing to hazard a guess where the price of oil will be, say, 3 years from now.
That's easy. It'll go many places in there. Anything we say is going to act accurate. Anyways, do you want to take a
Sure,
stab
I'll
at-
take a stab at that. I mean, I think that that basically it's going to be a long time before those types of technologies really reshape how people think about energy policy. So, and I think part of the reason is that there's sort of elementary research going into those areas, but it hasn't reached the sort of tipping point on urgency to really see much more substantial investment going into that, including kind of federal R&D dollars in a big way. So, I would say that over time, as the narrative around climate change develops and presumably strengthens, that starts to become a bigger deal, but you're probably looking at least a decade before that kind of urgency really comes into the debate. And, the recent developments in terms of less urgency on the part of the U.S. in particular around this issue probably sets that back a little bit too.
Can I just jump in and say one thing about the geoengineering or climate engineering? Since we're talking about geopolitics, I see a big geopolitical crisis around this, because you think about it right now and presumably for the foreseeable future, there are no understood or shared institutions or norms about how geoengineering would be used. And the technologies that are being explored are not very expensive from the perspective of a nation state. So it's conceivable that certain of these technologies could be deployed by wide numbers of countries, and there's nothing to say that one country won't decide to do this and hurt the climate, which is obviously global, and have adverse effects on other countries. And we just don't have a mechanism at this point or an institution to try to manage that a little bit. What happens when China wants to engineer the climate and India doesn't? And how is that going to be adjudicated? How is that going to be resolved? What are the penalties, if any, that are going to accrue if a country decides to deploy this and it has adverse effects on other countries?
So you all know the landscape of institutions, global institutions, multilateral ones that deal with standard setting and data gathering in the energy and climate space. If you were all called up by the good folks at the White House who were saying, we're getting this question a lot, we're ready for just at least a briefing to give us a sense of who we should look to initially to start thinking about where this kind of initial best practices or standard setting or formalized dialogue should begin, what do you say? What institution should be should incubate such a capacity? Sure, Divya.
I mean, I think there is no, as Megan mentioned, there is no currently no sort of systematic effort to tackle this on a multilateral basis. I mean, I would say that that if a working group were structured as part of the UNFCCC process, then that could be a good place to start, because it sort of brings together all the relevant stakeholders, and it's sort of, in terms of the framework that's set up, they often do sort of designate working groups to work on different areas that may or may not, kind of become salient at a given kind of COP process. So that potentially could be one place to start. Another area, though it's a little more tangential, is perhaps through the IEA. So we have a smaller sort of set of stakeholders, but potentially something through that. One kind of example or kind of comparison point is that there is a global institute on CCS, and they're sort of similar. It's less of a kind of global problem. It's a little more localized compared to geoengineering. But there's kind of an international body, and it includes companies that are active in the space that try to develop best practices, and that could serve as a bit of a precedent.
Right. I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just want to say, so I ask my students this every year for my energy class. We had this actually, one of my former students is sitting right over there, Alejandro. And I would say that we haven't yet come back with the real good answer. It seems that a lot of people come forward with the UN as the obvious place, something like a Paris Accord kind of. But I think the better parallels might be looking to something like the NPT and look at how that was modeled and see if you could build on something, an institutional arrangement that model that. But I think it's a really, really hard question, and I imagine that it will go from the theoretical to the practical in a pretty short period of time, within the decade.
Disruptive technologies are,
both
stick.
the Bush administration and the Obama administration used the instrument of the Major Economies Forum as a way to look at some of these energy, climate, technology related issues. So that would be another potential forum for discussion. It doesn't have status, but it might be a place to go.
Yeah, but you have all these small countries like the Maldives.
That's right.
That
We're not
really
going to play.
matters to them.
So I acknowledge that my interest in asking this question comes from a place of thinking about how does one approach interesting and new issues of climate or environmental policy if the United States, which is often looked to as a leader, steps back? So what then emerges as the next appropriate institution in which creative conversations can take place? But we're going to take a couple more questions. We had one. There was don't see that hand anymore. So, yep, right in the middle. Yep. to you, and then we'll take yours.
Yes, thank you. Geir Westgard with Statoil. I have two questions for the panel. The first is, to what extent do you consider that rumors of the death of OPEC are exaggerated? And the second question relates to something that Megan O'Sullivan said about US energy abundance strengthening both the soft and hard power of the United States. My question is, could this energy abundance also reinforce or strengthen tendencies of strategic retrenchment, selective engagement, or unilateralism in US foreign policy?
Would anyone like to start? Professor?
Megan.
So I'll take the second, Geir, and then maybe others will take the OPEC one. I think that it's certainly there's the risk that this move to U.S. energy abundance does strengthen those tendencies towards withdrawal and retrenchment. I think it would be a misinformed take, in the sense that when we really look at the most obvious example, and this is the U.S. engagement in the Middle East, you hear that from citizens, from policymakers who happen also to be citizens, but you hear this logic, which sounds on the face of it to make sense. We no longer need to look to the Middle East as a source of our energy. Therefore, we don't need to be engaged in costly and controversial endeavors there. And so that seems to make sense to a lot of people. But of course, this goes back to the point about if you incorporate an analysis of market dynamics in there, most people in this room will probably appreciate, well, as long as we're all members of one global market on oil, what happens in the Middle East will affect us not exactly in the same way, but in largely the same way, even if we're not consuming oil from the Middle East. Because a disruption in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or wherever will have an impact on global price that will affect American consumers. So again, after my question of what is contango, I would ask, are the prices that you pay for gas at your local gas station determined on the global market or not? And I'm sure most people would say it's a dance, and then no, not determined on the global market, which of course they are. So I think there's a lot of misinformation about there. And that I think America still has like that interest in being a champion of global markets that it has always had. So I do think that strengthens retrenchment, but I think that would be a misinformed action if it were to result from it. From energy reasons.
Well, let me turn to Ed. Hold on one second. I'll go to Ed first and then to you, David.
I was going to go to the OPEC question.
Yeah, no.
Geir, when I wrote the piece last year about bromance, I also thought about subtitling it ROPEC. I have a fundamental problem with the OPEC, non-OPEC agreement, which assumes that the more parties you bring into an agreement, the easier it is to manage, when the opposite is true.
Yeah.
The fewer the parties you have in a cartel, the easier it is to manage the cartel, if that's what OPEC is. So I really think of the current agreement as a Saudi-led, and with, as I said, Saudi Arabia overperforming on the production cuts, and with its traditional allies like Kuwait, UAE, so on, going along with it, and everyone else cheating. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan has no ability to cut their production. They can't even have the legal basis to tell the Western oil companies that are producing their oil to cut their production. Russia is the only one that's doing anything in the non-OPEC side of the agreement. So to me, at least the current situation is a Saudi-Russia agreement, fundamentally. So does that mean the demise of OPEC? Political institutions never seem to fade away. They just keep going forever, even after they've outlived their usefulness. But probably as a institution, OPEC is going to be there for quite a long time. But as an effective cartel to control production and to influence pricing, I think we're really talking about no more than a handful of countries, not the 20-some countries that are involved in the OPEC, non-OPEC agreement.
Just one brief comment here. I think the anomalous element of the OPEC Plus agreement is that it's taking place at a time then it shouldn't be. The test of cartels isn't when demand is high. It's not at the upside of the global business cycle. The test is on the downside. And I think the fact that OPEC believes that it's had to have a supply agreement on the upside of the cycle actually is a sign of weakness. But it's not going to go away. I agree with Ed. But the testing time is when the downturn comes.
Can I just make a footnote on just the Venezuela point, which I think is also important, that this agreement has had the results that it has because of the points that Ed made, but also because Venezuela has effectively cut its production dramatically, not out of the goodness of its heart, but just because it's been unable to maintain production. So it's met its quota many times over for cuts.
And Russia's leased the rest of it. So anyway,
Yeah.
there was a question in the back. Is that yours was next? Let's take yours, and then we'll take yours as well, and then we'll do one more round.
Hello, Joe. Is this on?
Yep. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Hello, Justin Marinelli. Ms. Reedy, you mentioned that there is a significant geographic concentration of rare earth minerals in China. That's where most of the world's supply comes from. How might a potential opening up of North Korea with its own significant reserve impact not only the market, but the strategic calculation of those countries that desire access to those minerals?
Thank you. Before you answer it, let's just take your question as well. Yep, in the back here. Further back. Yep.
My name is Martin Recently, President Trump criticized OPEC, and I was wondering what kind of policy he can implement to lower the oil prices.
I was hoping
Could you
someone would
repeat
bring
that?
up the
What can Trump do to lower oil prices?
Presumably by Twitter diplomacy.
That was an example of Twitter. The point of Twitter diplomacy is to not have to act.
That's one answer. That's one. Anyone else want to take that last one first, and then we'll come to the rare earths question?
I just make
Please,
sort of
yeah.
a comment on the tweet. It's interesting because it sort of reflects a little bit of an old mindset in terms of energy markets and OPEC and this whole idea that it's the U.S. versus OPEC and that increasing prices is bad for America. Well, it affects the prices that Americans pay at the pump, but it's great for American producers. Right. And American producers are now this part of this whole energy dominance and making America great again and more oil and gas production. And so the higher the price goes, the more and more American production that becomes commercial. So it did seem to me to be half a tweet, or
Absolutely.
a confusing tweet, surprising.
And in the short term, he could not pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement. That might help the oil price.
Yes. That's
That
a
would
very
definitely
concrete.
exactly. Yeah.
Furthermore, not impose an oil embargo on Venezuela.
Right.
But to immediate direct impact. Yeah. Divya, rare earths.
Rare earths. So, the issue with rare earths is not so much that there isn't supply out there that could be brought online. So, North Korea does have a lot of reserves, so does Australia, so does the United States. The issue is that it is costly and very kind of economically ugly to bring into production. So, often it's the sort of ecological, environmental impact that's the deterrent. It's also, on the economic side, that because China is producing so much of this, the economic case for other reserves to be brought into production is quite thin. And so, even though a few years ago there's a huge motivation for the U.S., for example, to restart its rare earths production, when the sort of export limitations that China put in place went away because of a WTO filing, that once again the market was abundant and there was no economic case to bring it into service. So I don't think that North Korea opening up necessarily will result in a flood of investment to develop rare earths. I think that, if the rare earths market tightens again, there are other places where investment might go first.
Okay, we're going to collect several last questions from here and here. I'm going to add one of my own, and then your remarks will end our panel.
Elizabeth Pond, I'm an author and journalist in Berlin, Germany. I just happened to be in Washington today, so I came along to this. And I'd like to ask a question that may be too specific. I found the whole discussion fascinating, and if you just want to skip it, do it. But I would like to ask if any of you would like to comment on the second pipeline from Russia to Germany. And if you want to skip it, go ahead.
No, Nord Stream 2.
Nord Stream
It's
2.
front and center for
That's a good question.
all of us. To you, yeah.
Yeah. I just turned it off. Ken Meyercord, I produce a TV show called Civil Discord. As a longtime proponent of the peak oil theory, I feel compelled to rain a bit on the oil bonanza parade and point out that while our production has increased dramatically over the last decade from about 5 million barrels a day to 10 million, around 10 million, it was only recently that the amount of energy we received from domestic sources exceeded the energy we imported. In fact, I think we're still ahead of China as the world's largest importer of crude oil. No? Who is it?
China has been.
Yeah.
China's number one. We're
Yeah,
number two.
yeah.
Okay. 8 million barrels a day anyway is what we import at this time. The increase in production over the last few years has come from, in other words, it's widely agreed that peak oil by conventional means, oil production by conventional means, global oil production in the U.S., peaked in 2005. Most of that increase has been from non-conventional methods like fracking. And one of my favorite sayings is that a world in which we are fracturing the earth and squeezing tar from sands and drilling in the deep ocean and feeding corn to our cars is not a world swimming in oil. We aren't doing these things because they're cheap. They're expensive. And we have to take that into account even as we see production increase.
Maybe
with regard to LNG,
May we have your question, please? Because we're running close on time.
real close. One thing about fracked wells, oil or gas, is their depreciation rate goes down very quickly. They're pretty much worn out after 5 years. With regard to LNG, with our conversion of so many electric plants from coal to natural gas, we could actually face a shortage in this country, which would definitely affect our ability to export. And our exports so far have been trivial. The UK, the first 6 shipments of LNG this year to the United Kingdom, the gas originated in Russia. Is this going to be an increasing factor if, in the future for the panel, if the UK imports more and more of its natural gas from that Yamal field? And also, could one of the factors behind the rapprochement between South and North Korea be the prospect of a natural gas line from Russia through North Korea to South Korea?
Thank you. I'm going to add one last question here, and this pivots off the question of the gentleman about looking forward to the price of oil in the next several years. I'm just going to pose it in the way saying, let's assume that the price is going to go up in the near-ish term. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this means for the politics in the United States now, and then maybe also policy regarding non-hydrocarbon energy, so renewables now, what the signal becomes in that environment. So we could start with Nord Stream, or actually we have a collection of gas questions, gas linkage questions as well. Nord Stream, Yamal, and Northeast Asian gas pipeline. Let's start with you, Ed.
Could I select the ones I wanted to
Yes,
answer?
you may.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll leave, much to the surprise of some in the audience, I will leave the Nord Stream 2 question to others. Peak oil. So I've been in this business for 40-some years, and what used to be unconventional production has become conventional production in the course of those years. Secondary recovery used to be unconventional, then tertiary recovery became unconventional. Now we have hydraulic fracturing, which is unconventional. The unconventional production now represents more than 50% of U.S. production. So what is conventional, what is unconventional is a definitional problem. The difference between shale and the previous revolution is that we have increased the resource base because we're now tapping the source rock. And the question is the economics of extracting from the source rock is mainly an economic question rather than a resource question. On top of that is now, whereas it was fashionable some years ago to talk about peak oil, we're now talking about peak demand. And so the people with resources have to worry about whether we will see peak demand before we run out of oil, just like we probably have seen peak coal demand at some point in the future, even though we have in the United States 200 years of coal reserves. So I'm not hung up on peak oil, I have to say. U.S. LNG, the benefit of U.S. LNG has nothing to do with whether we ship LNG to Europe or not. Because most of our LNG will ultimately go to South America and Northeast Asia. The benefit of U.S. LNG to the global market is that it brings liquidity, less restrictions on trading, so we have a lot more short-term trading, as Megan said, making LNG a lot closer to crude oil than it used to be. It brings gas-on-gas competition to parts of the world that have never seen gas-on-gas competition. We will get away from oil price indexation of gas prices.
Be capitalized upon if infrastructure investments are made, because in the Permian, where there's an enormous potential to drill more oil, there's a lot of associated gas with that. And so you actually have people talking about, what do we do with all that gas in the Permian Basin? Are we going to flare that? And that's kind of an interesting conversation, because the answer is that would be very controversial. So is the infrastructure going to be made to allow for even more U.S. LNG? So I would say, I definitely would watch this space in terms of the U.S. and LNG. But going back to the earlier points, the ones Ed just reiterated, it really is the implications for market structure that are so interesting and so consequential for geopolitics. I was fascinated that up until Ed's comments right now, we really haven't talked about demand. We've talked a lot about supply and peak oil and supply, but demand is, another really interesting and important variable to watch. Of course, it's been very robust oil demand over the last few years, but there's a very active debate about when that's going to tail off and what that means for all of these parameters. Divya, I'm sure we'll talk about the renewables question that Liz asked. So I'll just throw a marginal point, but a kind of interesting one. It depends on how high a price we're talking. So I think if we are making the assumption that prices are going up, you are factoring in that one or more of these geopolitical nerve-wracking situations is going to be realized. And if we think back to when oil was $140-something a barrel, look at the conversations that were being had in Congress. They were about coal to liquids technology. So that is a technology not very environmentally friendly, but it made economic sense in that environment, and it made national security supply sense in that environment. So, we could even return to those days. I wouldn't predict it, but certainly we shouldn't assume that high prices just means more of a push for renewable energy.
Yeah,
So
I'm leaving you
Poli-
Nord Stream 2, because I know you have thoughts on it.
Nord Stream 2. So,
And she's clearly not from Washington if she said, no, don't answer it. Because
As Chancellor Merkel.
so Chancellor Merkel's coming to town, and I think that Nord Stream 2 is not as strategic as an issue as it used to be. I mean, it's really important. The Russians put a great deal of symbolic importance to it. That if you look at the actual data on European consumption of Russian gas, it hasn't changed very much. If you talk to European officials who work in the energy space, in their view, the world has changed. And the world has changed not because they're using another resource, but because they have the ability to use another resource. So that Russia's ability to exert pressure on Europe through gas exports has diminished very, very, very substantially. So that's, I don't know where Nord Stream 2 is going to end up, but I don't think it's as decisive an issue as it once was. On the politics of oil prices here, it's an interesting issue because it'll be interesting to see if the president takes that into account at all, explicitly or implicitly, in terms of his decision on what to do about JCPOA. But it certainly would seem to me that, I mean, what you've had in the last 6 months is political risk creeping back into the oil price. And I think that the biggest element of that will be if you have a U.S. exit, the assumption among American policymakers has been that the Iranians aren't going to do very much about that. Foreign Minister Zarif was in New York, and he said, you know, if the U.S. leaves, that's the end of the deal. So I don't think you can discount, given the new near equilibrium on supply demand, I don't think you can any longer discount the possibility of more of a price spike here than is being priced in. If the Iranians return, if they do leave the deal, if they do anything to return to enrichment, if they increase pressure on Israel, none of these, I think, are things that that anybody can decisively say won't happen. So I do think that you could get some price moves. Of course, the president has the ability in that circumstance to open up the U.S. SPR, and you know, I think he would do it. I think he would not be as constrained by using the SPR as some other presidents would have done about sort of undermining market forces in the energy markets. I just don't think he can.
Thank you. I've broken my promise in that we've gone over, but I want to give the last word to Divya to address the last question I asked.
Yeah, so, I mean, just on the oil price, the other sort of case to be made for the possibility of a significant run-up in oil prices is that, you know, if you assume that demand will continue to grow at the same sort of strong pace that it's been growing, and you have not a lot of new upstream investment that is actually required to underpin future demand growth, then you could see a scenario where the price does tighten up quite a bit. But to your point, Liz, I think that if you did have a run-up in the prices, I think it would be an enabler for policy that really pushes alternatives.
Even now.
Even now, yeah, because I think that there's a separation between alternative energy as a climate change policy and alternative energy as an economic policy. So, you know, I think that's
crossed the Rubicon. We're there now.
I think we're close to there, yeah. Because if you look at renewables, you know, you see a lot of sort of red states that have very strong renewables policies, and it has nothing to do with climate change.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much to all of you, and won't you all join me in thanking our panel with a round of applause?